There's people that want to leave us with nothing. The people that have retirement homes in Maui and Arkansas and Arizona want to leave us a desert, and they want to spend it all while they're here. They didn't want to have the permanent fund anyway. And the permanent fund is only 25% of the bonuses and royalties. The other 75%, the legislature just pissed against the wall. And, if we'd put it all in, we'd have had 480 billion by now, and you wouldn't have this problem. But no, they had to spend it like it was recurring. And Walter Levy, who we hired, he was a Jew that was the advisor to the Saudi family, which sounds funny, but in the Muslim world, the Jews run it all pretty well. And he said, remember, oil by its very nature is an enclave within your state. To consider it part of your future is to court disaster. There will be a day that the only Eskimo that sees Prudhoe Bay will be an Eskimo looking for a caribou. The oil will be gone. And it's not a case of when or how soon, probably not for quite a while, but it is not endless. And we were just trying to take a small portion and convert it from a non-renewable to a renewable resource. Now, Hammond's coming in with the dividend was a way to ensure that we had it. But that goes back to Arlen Tusing, who, when we said, what should we do with this surplus money? He said, work a system where the people get a share so that they appreciate that it's theirs. What people do not understand, if they come from the other states or even some of our own, is that we are the only land grant state in the nation. We receive, every other state, the oil is privately owned. In Texas, you pay the rancher to go look, and then you pay him his 12.5% royalty if you find oil, and the state charges 20% to run the state with. And here in Alaska, we own it both. We own the oil. We, the people, own the oil. We got a dowry of 100 million acres, of which Prudhoe Bay was on. And then we get 90% of what's in the federal, which they've pretty well cheated out of us by making it green. But it still comes down to the fact that the oil belongs to the people, not the government. And we didn't set the permanent fund up to run government. We set the permanent fund up to keep from blowing the money, other than we didn't have the dividend figured yet. But we knew that what we did want to do was find a way to give it to the people direct. We looked at things like medical, but anything that the bureaucracy gets, each year they'll need more. The bureaucracy is never well fed. It will always want more. And so the thing is that we have to find some way that the people get their share. Their POMVs, I'm not happy with that. I don't even want them. But if you had them, anything over 4% is a disaster. That means you'd be dipping into the principal on bad years. Remember, the money in the permanent fund is not oil money. Oil started it out, but the money comes from places like the mall at Falls Church, Virginia, and the other investments we have throughout the world. It's the investments that are making the money, not the oil. And we've already successfully done that. And the permanent, and people say, well, let's bring it home. And then I think of Elmer Rasmussen saying, never loan money to anyone you cannot foreclose on without political problems. And if we'd been loaning for the Diamond Wall and 08 came, we'd have lost our money. But when they missed it at Alexandria, Virginia, we shut them down and they opened Chase Manhattan on a Sunday and got us our money. Yeah.
Right. So Joe, let me get you into the discussion. I mean, right now we're hitting, billion-dollar deficits, right? And some things are guaranteed in the Constitution, like public education, public safety, uh, public health. But the one thing that's not in the Constitution is a PFD. What do you think about the situation we're in now, and how does that, what do we do coming into this legislative session? This is for Joe and for Mike. Mike wants to tune in also.
Mike will. Well, let me take a short thing and turn it over to Senator Schauer. But I come at this as an Alaskan who's been up here for more than 40 years, and I like the place. I've had the great good fortune of working with Clem Tillian when he was in the legislature, and it was sometimes a treat and sometimes a challenge. But I've learned a lot working with various individuals in both parties. But the most important thing is listening to Alaskans. And Alaskans who have been around for a while understand the permanent fund dividend is their little slice of the earnings from their fund. Unfortunately, we worked our way in a situation where we did spend too much and we saved too little. And there's this insatiable demand for all kinds of projects, whether it's the university or healthcare or just regular government services. And we are at the point where we have spent down all of our savings. And there's not a trick now. I mean, we all know, I think, and I'm not lecturing you, Senator Kawasaki or Senator Schauer or any of the members of the legislature, the bullet has already hit the bone here. And we need to figure out how to probably spend a little less, how to use the resources we have, including the earnings, in a way that continues to grow the permanent fund and pays some guaranteed dividend. I think it's, and I'll wind up here and turn it over to Colonel Schauer. It's absolutely critical that we have this session a resolution that is a resolution that will put before our voters in Alaska a way that we can guarantee protection for the permanent fund and that will pay a guaranteed constitutional dividend. Now, the ways and means of that are the rugged stuff that you all in the legislature have to sweat out. But if we don't have a resolution that goes before the voters here, we're looking at really essentially gutting one of the greatest things that Clem Tillian and Jay Hammond and Oral Freeman from Ketchikan, Hugh Malone, these people who saw we were blowing the money and that we had to save it. But Clem's right. This wasn't a savings account, for a government slush fund when we run out of oil revenue. This was a saving to turn non-renewable wealth owned by the people into a renewable resource. And now the challenge is, how are we going to protect that renewable resource and still give the citizens a little slice of their money?
Thanks, Joe. Mike, what do you think?
Thanks, Scott. And so we have some things to consider, and I will ask a couple questions here that perhaps Joe and Clem would want to, discuss a little bit from their point of view as well. One of those is I've heard a number of legislators say that, well, government services have cash value, and they want to basically equate that using the earnings for government as opposed to providing a dividend would have some cash value. Therefore, it would assuage the people that were upset about it being used for government. Of course, you have one of the problems, as we are aware, and Joe just said, is there is an insatiable appetite for government. Has grown to a point that we can't do it all and continue to pay a full dividend via the formula without, at this point, something changing. I do know that or I should say in 2019, Scott was around for this as well in the legislature. We had a number of polling things that were done, as well as hearings in various committees. And I will tell you what was fascinating. One of the things was when you look back at 1999, the people were asked what their position was, the dividend. and it was overwhelming. I believe it was around 70% or so, or 75% of the people said, don't touch the dividend. You know, we had problems and we've gone through this before. And then in 2019, 20 years later, with the testimony and the polling data, it was almost identical. You would think that with all of the push since 2016 to use more of the dividend for government, et cetera, well, maybe that would have changed, you know, the people's opinion, but it was almost identical. So fascinating to see how the people have responded. And I think we've also seen politically the results of those folks that kind of go against the dividend. They tend to not come back to their legislative seat. It's becoming a trend item. So you have to wonder if some of them might learn that lesson. So a last point here, as well as maybe like perhaps Clem and Joe talking to those points, is I think Scott and I both understand, you know, the math. I've heard some legislators, I think, that are a little bit, I don't know if the condescending would be the right word, but that seem to think that those of us that support the dividend can't do math. And I think every legislator can do math. And I think we all know we're at a point that we're going to have to do something different. The question becomes, what is that difference that we will have to do to make it work? And so Scott, myself, and others across the aisle from each other are going to have to make those hard choices, but it's going to involve things that is probably going to make people in a lot of sectors not that happy. We are, you know, if there's a change to the PFD, what would that be? What would that look like? And I think a lot of us go, you know, no less than 50-50 split of whatever that is. I've heard people talk about doing that 50-50 off the POMV or whatever it might be. Point is that some folks consider, you know, a change to that. But if we are going to do that, where is the legislation that's going to reduce smartly the expense of government, the cost? Because we're going to need that. What about a spending cap change to the one that we have, so we don't put ourselves in this boat moving forward? Are we going to look at SB 21 oil tax credits and make changes? Are we going to look at some sort of a tax? I mean, the bottom line, right? Scott knows this. We have to balance the books. How are we going to do it? How are we going to do it fairly? One of my concerns, this is my last point, Scott, is that for taking the dividend, we continue to hurt the poorest Alaskans, the ones that can afford it the least. So,
well, you know, it's the golden rule in reverse. But, you know, it's kind of like the saying the horses naturally want to be fed first and let the sparrows pick among the droppings. I'm got kind of tired of being a sparrow. You know, I want the, you know, you are going to have to face things that you want a road without chuck holes in it. You're going to have to pay a little more fuel tax. We have the lowest in the nation, but that's your worry. If you postpone it, if you just go on doing what you're doing now, kicking the thing down the road and stealing from the permanent fund, not inflation proofing it, in 10 or 15 years, it'll be gone and you'll still have the problem in front of you. What are you going to do then? Well, if you do it now, it'll be a lot less painful, even though it will be painful now.
Yeah, thanks for that, Clem. We did have a question from Winter Marshall Allen, who asked about oil tax credits, and I'm glad that Senator Shower sort of previewed that. But oil tax credits are, you know, they've been talked about. We had a initiative last year. It failed. But you know, what about oil tax credits? Are they on the books? Are they worthy of looking at, though the public has already voted them down? That's for anybody.
I'll take it, Scott, real quickly,
Okay.
and then let one of the others. You know, it's a fascinating dichotomy to me as we discuss this, because I'm supposed to be this you know, far right guy, right? Very conservative, don't want taxes, you know, protect companies at all costs, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it gets very misconstrued because, you know, as I alluded to a few minutes ago, in a case like where we have put ourselves here in the state, I believe politically, and that is of course part of the problem Scott and I and others have to look at, is how do you solve the problem? Because I believe it was Clem just saying that, you know, we're not solving the problem, and the farther we go down this road, the worse it gets. And when you consider that we have somewhere between 100 and $200 million a year of planned increases to spending every year, already cooked into the books, the next 5 years, we're $500 million further down that hole. So what are we going to do? And a solution that probably makes everybody a little bit upset is politically probably the thing we're going to be able to do that might help us solve the problem. That's why I mentioned all of those things before, because to make this work, we're going to have to do more than just one thing. We can't just take the dividend. We can't just raise taxes. Any of these things by themselves don't get us there. So while I was not supportive of oil tax changes via initiative, because I generally don't like that process, I think it's something that we have to explore. We need to do it legislatively so we can do it smartly. We can debate it, vet it, have all sides have input to it, and hopefully find a viable solution that still works for the state, that doesn't overly penalize what is still our strongest and most productive industry for the state, but also ask them to also step up to the plate and help us. But we've got to show good faith, right? I mean, we got to show that we can also try to reduce the cost of government. That's one of the reasons I am a proponent of changing the spending cap and making it stronger, so we can also show industry that we're going to constrain ourselves moving forward and be good partners and not do what we typically do, which is spend money and then go reaching out to everybody and saying, gimme. It's the same thing we're doing with the dividend, right? We're hurting the poorest Alaskans the most because we haven't been able to constrain spending. So we're going to reach for the easiest source, which for 5 years has been the dividend. So kind of a long answer. I apologize, Scott, but it is something I believe that we have to look at and has to be a part of that total solution. And I think that's probably the most balanced and politically possible approach we might find.
What I would suggest is, if you solve the problem of taking the permanent fund off the table to where the government gets a fixed amount, but the people get a fixed amount, at least 50-50, and it's guaranteed, and you have you either have it the way the law says now, or if you go POMV, nothing over 4%, because that's what the Rockefeller Foundation and the others use for theirs, and it's the only one that allows for growth. And then as far as right now, we're paying the oil companies to take our oil due to the panic of running out of gas in Anchorage. They say, well, we don't want energy equalization for the bush, but you get cheap gas in Anchorage. You don't get that as the market price. And I'm not saying that you should, but come on, be honest about it. All I'm saying is that until we take the permanent fund off the table to where this is how much you get and no more, we won't address the other problems.
The original question came from one of the viewers, and it was about, what about SB 21, which implicitly is, can't we get more revenue? And it's actually something that many Alaskans look at right away as their first solution to the fiscal crisis that our state, that all of us are facing. And the second thing that people say is, well, maybe we'll get lucky and oil prices will leap up to $80 or $90 a barrel.
Oh, yeah.
I think both of those, while they're not wrong to hope for higher oil prices or increased production or more revenue from the oil companies, Clem Tillion is absolutely right. The first and foremost task for the legislature is to deal with protecting permanently the permanent fund, and secondly, guaranteeing a permanent fund dividend. If you solve that issue first, the other issues like should there be revenue augmentation, when we're talking taxes, those fall into place. Issues like cuts and consolidation of government, which I frankly think Alaska needs and is required, those will fall into place. But the temptation for too many people, and especially the politicians, is say, we're going to come up with this grand, comprehensive revenue cuts, consolidation, PFD, and everything. And it won't work. You got to do it one step at a time. And the first step, the most critical step, is to deal with permanent protection of the permanent fund and the PFD issue in the Constitution. Now, I'll pick up a little bit on what Clem was talking about, the percentage of market value. a lot of people talk about the POMV. And in fact, it's the platform that gets batted around. And we're even using it in a limited way via statute, which is not enforceable. The so-called 5.25 down to 5%. If we use the POMV, let's be clear, there's two huge issues that we have to solve. First, what is the percentage we will take from the market value of the permanent fund assets? And you set it too high, even at 5%, it will mean the permanent fund is no longer permanent. And don't believe me, ask Angelo Rodell and the Permanent Fund Corporation. They did a stress test, pegged at about 5%, and you know what? It fails in fairly short order. So picking the right metric for the percentage, which is at or very close to 4%, makes sense. I mean, you can use 5 or you could even use 6, but you'd have to have in a guaranteed fix for inflation, which basically complicates things. So using 4, just like almost all prudent foundations use, is the way to go. Then you have to deal with the second big, brutally hard task for Scott Kawasaki and Senator Schuyler and all of their colleagues. How are you going to split, the 4%? And right now the public expects 50-50. But every person down in the legislature and all the constituent groups, whether they're unions or the contractors, they all do the back of the envelope yield on 4%, hit it by 0.50, and they go, that's not enough. But I'll just end by saying Clem Tillion is right, and all the economists I've talked to, the first step is not dealing with all these constitutional proposals that are floating around here. First and foremost, deal with the permanent fund and the PFD. Then everything else will kind of fall in behind it and will resolve itself.
Mr. Moderator, I think
Thanks.
what we're getting in this thing is how valuable the permanent fund is to the economy of Alaska.
Yes.
It keeps the story alive in the villages. It spreads the money out. We're the only state in the union that the difference between the rich and the poor has not changed in the last decade. And it's because of the fund. People say, well, what do they do? What do those natives do out there in the bush to earn it? It's their land. We're expecting the oil to be ours because we're Alaskan. Well, they should get a cut too, But what I'm saying is that when you pour that much money into the economy of Alaska, the permanent fund itself is a major economic engine. We looked up on the Kenai Peninsula. If we had gotten a full dividend from the very beginning, since before Walker's veto, we'd have been spent $320 million on the Kenai. That would have done a hell of a lot more than anything we've done with the government.
Can I jump in here, Scott? May I for just a moment?
Well, yeah, and I just want to say that it's to be understated that the PFD is an amazing part of the economy, and Clem, he articulated it very well that the money that goes into rural Alaska through a PFD or goes to the local economy, for that matter, is amazing. And I've been lucky to be a beneficiary of a PFD. I went to college on my PFD. I bought my first car with my PFD. I bought my first computer with my PFD. And I think it's it's not to be understated that the PFD is an amazing boost to our local economy. Mike, I have a couple other questions that have come in, but yeah, go ahead, Mike, if you want to.
I would I do. Thanks, Scott. And I agree with that. I want to highlight that before I answer a kind of a correction, if you will, for what Clem and Joe were saying for my point. But I want to answer that first because you guys are talking about something very important, and that is how good the PFD is for regular Alaskans, how much it helps them. I continue to harp on that point that, the Alaskans that can least afford to have the dividend taken away are the ones that, of course, as a percentage are being affected the most. Because if you take an example, Scott, and you may remember, I said this on March 28th in my floor speech when we could not get a full PFD. I said, look, you got this COVID thing happening and tens of thousands of Alaskans are losing their jobs. And I use my daughter as an example. And some legislators were saying, well, $1,200 for each adult, and $500 for each kid is not going to, help a lot. And, a full PFD isn't going to do much. And I said, well, let's think about this. My daughter would get then $3,400 for her family of 4. But if we had passed a full PFD, which wasn't going to go real far, right? Maybe a month they could survive, because at the time one of them had lost a job with this, what's been happening. But I said, imagine if we actually paid a full PFD. That's $12,000 more dollars. That puts them over $15,000. My daughter could have made that last for probably 3 or 4 months at least of the year, even without any pay. So it's hugely helpful. And I got a stat for you that I think is fascinating. Did you know that we only grow $40 million worth of our food, but Alaskans import $2 billion? $2 billion. The dividend is almost $2 billion. So it could literally, in some ways, almost feed the state. Not entirely, but it's very, very important. But Scott, here's my last point I want to answer to Joe and Clem, and then move on, is that what I want to be clear, gentlemen, is I agree with you. It is the elephant in the room. We've been fighting over it. It's been taking the oxygen up, and we need to solve it. There's no doubt, and I don't disagree. What I wanted to illuminate with the rest of those things, or those are solutions that will help us ultimately solve the problem. And I know I'm not naive that we cannot solve it all at once, and we're not going to get all those things. I just am trying to educate people. They need to understand that to truly finally solve Alaska's problem moving forward, after I hope we get something done on the PFD so we stop fighting it, is we have to do those other things at some point to make the math work. And the Alaskans need to understand that. That's my point. So thank you, Scott. I appreciate the time for that.
If I might-
Thanks, man. And let me just add, because this was a question that came from folks online. Paul Hamby, I'm not sure where he's from, and Rick Mazzoni sort of had dueling questions. One of them was, we're overspending in the state legislature. Why does that justify rating the PFD? Rick Mazzoni says, why aren't we talking about revenues? And so I wanted to have that question. We will have further conversations about this in the future, because the PFD is obviously intertwined with what we're talking about today. And thank you for Senator Shower's comments there. We need to have these discussions. But are we overspending? Do we need to talk about revenues? And I think that the first person to talk about that would be Joe Geldof, who mentioned it early on.
Well, I, of course, believe that not only are cuts needed, but there are cuts to be had in the state budget, particularly including in the area of what we call the general fund area. I also think there's an absolute need for consolidation of some of the agencies, which would yield some money. Now, I frankly listen to people say all the time, "Oh, that would be short money. It's only $3 million here. That's not really worth it." But the fact of the matter is, the public, including the gentlemen who have called in, they have, and virtually every Alaskan you talk to has their favorite anecdotal story about somebody who's on the payroll that's just a political hack and a pal of whoever's in charge of the hiring process, or a program that is not functioning properly. And we absolutely have to to stay in good faith with the citizens that we're working with, or in the case of Senators Kawasaki and Shower, that are accountable to their constituents. We have to say that we're going to do that. Now, I'm not changing my mind about addressing that, but I think there's a logical sequence in which you will get to the cuts and consolidation. And it's a little bit like when you do a jigsaw puzzle. If you do one, you flip it out of the box onto the table. What's the first thing you do? You get all the tiles on the right side. And the next thing you do is get the corner pieces and the edges around, if you're somewhat accomplished at all in a jigsaw puzzle. In the jigsaw puzzle of our finances for our state, which include cuts, consolidations, maybe spending caps, new revenues, how are we going to do that? The permanent fund and the permanent fund dividend. The permanent fund and the permanent fund dividend are the corner pieces of the puzzle. And you get those down and everything starts falling in place. And I'll swing out, but I wanted to go back briefly to Senator Shower's thing about cash value. Sure, I hear people talk about cash value of government programs and everything. And odds are it's somebody who can see the cash value. If you're a division director and you're getting paid 20, at a range 28 or a range 26 and everything, yeah, you see the cash value of that. A lot of our government services benefit people, but that argument about cash value is like politicians talking about investing in this and everything. Most of them don't know anything about real cash value, and most of them don't know anything about investing. It's just rhetorical flourishes. So what good politicians do is they don't get hung up in nomenclature and lingo about cash value and all that other stuff. It's a bunch of hooey in a lot of cases. What they do is look carefully at the problem, work with their colleagues to analyze their way into a solution, and then act on that solution. Colonel Showers is familiar with the old OODA loop. We already have observed we got a problem here. We're deep into the second part of the OODA, the orientation stuff here. We got a problem with orientation. There's people who think we shouldn't have any taxes. There's people who think we shouldn't do this or that. But we've got to get through that orientation stuff, then decide and act, because time is wasting. We're out of money. The statutory budget reserve account is blown. The constitutional budget reserve account is blown. Look, there's politicians already angling. They're going to spend all the money in ADA on the reserves and everything else. And it's time for our legislature to act concerted way to come up with a plan and then implement it. And that's starting with the PFD and the permanent fund.
Well, what Joe's saying is, if you're down in a hole and you're having trouble getting out, at least stop digging. You're down. What we have facing us are things like the Inland Boatmen's Union. We signed agreements with them that we will have to pay. We have judges that have retired on $200,000 a year. We have to pay. We have commitments we made to the oil companies. We have to pay. And these are dead horses. They're not going to pull a cart again. They're gone. Most of the people have retired elsewhere. Very few have stayed here. And the money is gone. There's people that worry about us paying some for income tax. Well, I'm in the 30% bracket, or was until this year when I had no business. So that uncle would pay a third of my tax, but it still comes down to the fact that I don't object to my federal income tax. It means I got a job. It means I'm bringing in money. I don't pay it if I don't have money. A sales tax doesn't hurt my ranchers, but a property tax is deadly to them, because a ranch has a lot of land and not much income. My fishermen, I went to the UFA, they're ready and willing to have an increase in taxes, but they don't want to find that it's just used to pave Northern Lights Boulevard in Anchorage. I think we're going to have to address this in many different ways. But when the Chamber of Commerce got us to repeal all of our taxes, blazing saddles. I mean, we pulled the trigger.
Yeah, good luck. You couldn't make that movie today. Hey, Scott, may I ask a question of Clem and Joe, if it's okay?
Yeah,
You bet.
absolutely.
So
Thanks,
you bet. So for both of the gentlemen, it's kind of a fascinating question of, how much can we do in the sense of some sort of a tax? Because there, as Clem was just pointing out, we have to have more than, and that's one of the things I think it's important for Alaskans to hear. One solution isn't really going to solve this, especially as we move down the road, based on where we sit. As Clem was pointing out, the things that we have committed to pay for, plus increases coming, it only goes up. So one of the things would be, when you look at how would we solve that problem, from a taxing perspective, but it goes to, just as the PFD became a mechanism to keep the people involved, because one of the things people do usually respond to is you take money out of their wallet, they get pretty fired up. Well, in one sense, I see some sort of a tax that would be, called a sales tax, an income tax, whatever it may be. That's just a direct tax type, would seem to have the same type of an impact, especially potentially on wealthier Alaskans, better off, because now we're finally taking money out of their pockets as opposed to only the bottom 80%, that really seem to be upset about the PFD because of how that works as a percentage of income. So I was curious, Scott, if perhaps they could talk about how they would see that impact and what that might mean for tax and spend policy of the state, because taxes would tend to, potentially affect better off Alaskans more. So would it have the same impact the PFD did on protecting the permanent fund of helping to constrain spending and policy of those legislators and governors in Juneau? Thank you.
Thanks,
Well,
Mike. Yeah. If maybe Joe wants to mention that. We do want to sort of get back into where we've got a couple different forums that are going to happen, mostly on the PFD, also on taxes, budget. We'll have those discussions later, but
Scott, I'm happy to defer. If it's for later, I'm fine with that. It was
no, it's fine. It's fine, Mike. Yeah. I think this is good. It's a good topic because it does, they're intertwined. We need to talk about how we balance the budget carefully, and how we have a balanced budget. And so it's important. But then I want to steer back to the permanent fund and the PFD in the next question.
Well,
So Joe?
I might be able to deal with what Senator Kawasaki wants us to do here and sort of even answer Senator Shower's question. And first of all, for those of you watching this who are saying, who's Geldof? And he's a lawyer down in Juneau. I'm a member of the Permanent Fund Defenders, and I'm pleased to be working with Clem Tillian, who's our chairman, and we work with Rick Halford, who was a president of the Alaska Senate, and Jack Hickel, medical doctor up in Anchorage, and Juanita Caselius. But we're the board, and there's a number of people we work with, economists and people all over Alaska, in order to defend, first and foremost, the permanent fund. All of us are convinced that having a guaranteed permanent fund dividend is probably the single best way of ensuring that the permanent fund will also be protected in perpetuity. So how, and I said before, I don't like the percentage of market value because it has two really, really difficult questions that the politicians have to answer. But let me take a whack at a percentage of market value. Let's just say you set up a percentage of market value in the Constitution that all the assets, including in the corpus and the under the control of the Permanent Fund Corporation, that we would divert 4% of that every year, or 4.135 is a number that my favorite economist uses. He says that's a sustainable number over 100 years. Okay, if everybody magically agreed to that, and then you came up with an agreement that, okay, the citizens would get 50% and the legislature would get 50% to spend however they want, roads, education. And that was in the Constitution. That would calibrate the discussion about cuts and consolidation and revenue in a way that would be hugely beneficial to our state. So first and foremost, protect the fund, make sure that the citizens get their slice. And these are all things that politicians have to negotiate. But if you go above 4.5, you're in trouble in the long run with the fund. If you don't provide the citizens at some point with something approaching 50%, you'll have a scene that won't be quite like, what we saw last Wednesday, but you're going to see the pitchforks, and the torches out. Because Mike Shower's right. 70 to 85% of Alaskans feel like because it's their money, it's their fund, and they want their little slice of the earnings, and they should get it.
Well, you're not going to solve it with any one tax. The idea that you'll find the perfect example, either the oil taxes or raise the fisheries taxes 1.5% or whatever, that's not where it's found. It's found, do the people of Alaska feel that they should drive on the roads that aren't maintained, or are they willing to pay to maintain their roads? Well, 8% doesn't pay the maintenance on Alaska's roads, but about 40 cents a gallon would. And so what you have to do is take each problem separately. But 3 million here, a million there. What do you mean? Anything that you save and anything that you bring in, however small, helps. And I don't want a big sales tax. But on the other hand, it annoys me to have all the tourists that I handle in the summer pay nothing. I don't want an income tax that's so heavy that it's a drag, but I don't mind one that's a percentage of my federal and I'll get some of it back. And I don't mind if the feds take some. After all, I am a member of the federal government, whether I like it or not. Under the happy, yeah. But it's you do this incrementally, and the sad thing is you can't do it with one system. How do you handle the inland boatmen's unions? You have those are contracts; they'll just drag them out of you. And but you've got to figure not only how to pay off the dead horses that are they're just the bones now, but you still owe for them, and you're going to have to figure that out. And you don't do it with one big tax solution, like the price of oil goes up and we solve all our problems. The price of oil could go up and it still wouldn't solve the problems. Remember, we got in this hole while we were getting $100 a barrel.
Precisely. Thank you, Clem. That's exactly what I'm trying to get across. That's in a nutshell.
Price of oil rises.
So I have a question for Senator Kawasaki and Senator Schauer. So my big fear is that we'll keep punting this down the road or kicking the can down the road, whatever metaphor you want. What do each of you see if we fail to deal either this session or at I think the latest, the second session of the upcoming legislature? What is Alaska going to look like if we don't deal with our fiscal picture and if we don't deal with permanent protection for the permanent fund and the permanent fund dividend? What's the result?
Scott's turn.
Thanks, Mike.
Oh, you're welcome.
I think that the folks who are online, the folks who are listening, really want us to do something to solve the PFD issue, whether that's in a constitutional way or not. I mean, I believe that the only way to protect the PFD is in the Constitution, and I think Mike believes that too. We need to do something there. Not everybody's going to like what happens there. It might be, smaller than they expect. I don't know, but it needs to be done within the Constitution in order to really have any sort of gravitas. And I think that's the way it needs to happen. And I think that's the way we're moving toward this legislative session.
Yeah,
Once that's done, Clem, I think that then the public can say, okay, you did it, you put it in the Constitution. We may not like the amount or whatever, but it's done. But it's done, and then we can balance our budgets, and that's the only way I think we'll see anything moving forward.
And since I was asked the question as well, I
don't
want
think-
to put Scott on the hot seat first, but I'm sorry, Cliff, I'll just go real quick. Is that I agree with Scott that having a permanent solution to the permanent fund and the permanent fund dividend is a constitutional solution. I know a lot of people do not like that. And quite frankly, I wish we didn't have to do that. However, my one addition to what Scott said is we have a tendency in the legislature to not necessarily follow our own statutes when we don't like them or they don't work or we've created a problem that we can't seem to solve. So a statutory solution concerns me because I don't think that actually solves our problem. And 2, 4, 6 years down the road, based on what happens, we may just ignore that one as well. So while it is certainly something I don't take lightly, I don't think any of us do, and it would be nice to know that a statutory solution would work. I foresee, based on our past performance, that a solution that does not involve a constitutional change, which is a heavy lift, and we need a lot of legislators to agree to that to get something to work. But without it, I think we'll still be contending with this for years to come. So there you go. Thanks.
Here, I agree with that. But as a chairman of the Permanent Fund Defenders, if you offer the people less than half, or go a POMV that's 5%, I'm going to recommend fighting it. In other words, unless it's one that will give my great-grandchildren something. My family, my father-in-law came to Chilkoot Barracks in 1912. We've already made an investment in this land. We've got kin buried all over, and not just the native part of the family, we got them too. But by God, I want something that my great-grandchildren have a fighting chance to have a few fish, a few roads that they can drive on, a future that looks good. And you're going to have to buckle down and pay a little now and give up some of the stuff that you like to do it. And I don't envy the guys that are in the legislature today. You are in a terrible position. But when I was in there at the early part of statehood, and Hillstrand, who'd been the last chairman of the territorial and the first chairman of the House Finance Committee, said if we cut 20% of the state employees, we balance the budget. If we cut 20% of the budget just straight across, we cripple Alaska. The bureaucracy will hold on to their jobs and stop doing the service. You have to actually get in there and remove departments.
So let's see. So let's ask another question. What's it going to take to move a PFD amendment to the Constitution to the legislature this year? Let's start with you, Clem, and then we'll move down the row. But what's it going to take?
First one that will the Permanent Fund Defenders will accept, and then push it through. And it's not going to be easy. But the thing is that they're by cutting it, say if you go a PMV of 4.5 or 4, I'd prefer 4. Then I know that my great-grandchildren will have funds because it will grow, and my population will grow. If on the other hand, you give me something that's 5%, I'll fight it. I'll recommend to the people they turn it down. The thing is that there's no sense recommending that the people do something that you know is going to walk right off the cliff. So it's got to be something, what you present to us has got to be something that we, the Permanent Fund Defenders, can go out and tell the people, this isn't everything you should have, but it's a reasonable compromise. Take it. But unless we're campaigning for it, I don't think, we fought it back when they tried to pay everybody off and end the fund, and we got 80-some% that said, no way. It's the people see the value of the fund. They don't see the taxes. They don't understand. People that voted for a 1% decrease in sales tax in my district didn't realize what they were going to do to their property taxes. They didn't think. Right. And so the thing is, the average guy wants to have a beer on Saturday night and wants to go down fishing on the Kenai, and he doesn't want to have to think about it. He hires you to do that.
Hey, Scott, can I ask an additional part of that question that you've asked as Clem and Joe?
Absolutely. Go for it.
So it's, the point is valid because we're discussing that about, solving that. And I understand the POMV problem. It's something that's been discussed at length while I was actually on the finance table until I was no longer on the finance table this last year. I won't go there. But I would like to perhaps have them also add to their answer, because you're asking how we would get there to do something about the PFD this year. But it brings up the problem of, if we were able to do that because of the deficit spending we're in based on revenue versus, what we have to actually spend, it presents a problem, because we're almost immediately into having to create more revenue, or we're going to start having to overdraw the ERA just to pay for the services. So how do we get there at the same time? Because it becomes a problem, like I said, almost immediately. So we do have to contend with that.
You're right. But is there a solution that doesn't get worse each year?
Well,
If
first
you
of
do,
all,
everybody be in a hole.
for just a reminder for Paul Hamby and Rick and everybody else who's listening out there, any solution that the legislature comes up with, that has to be passed by a supermajority, and then it goes out for a vote of the people. So this is one of those situations where all 60 members of the legislature need to work really hard, listen to each other, and come up with a permanent fund dividend constitutional amendment that actually works in the real world and works for Alaskans, because it can't be some fantasy government thing cooked up in a back room. It's got to pass muster, not only with the supermajority of the legislative members, but then it comes out for Paul Hamby to say yes or no, and Clem Tillian to say non-starter. So we've all got to work together. Now, I have some words of advice, or at least based on my observations, is for all 60 members of the legislature, don't invest any thinking in that some brilliant idea is going to come out of the administration, because right now there is a obvious lack of critical thinking in terms of how to approach our fiscal situation. And this is one where people of goodwill and through hard work in the legislature, and the legislature alone, are going to have to come up with a solution that can go before the voters. Now, it's easy to say, because remember, for those of you who don't know out listening to this thing, resolutions are not bills. This doesn't go to the governor to get massaged or vetoed or anything else. You need to be talking to all of your legislators saying, we want the permanent fund permanently protected, and we want a PFD that's guaranteed. Because Mike Shower's right. We pass a statute and everything, and as soon as it becomes inconvenient, it's like, oops, it gets ignored. And it's not just the PFD statute, it's any other statute. So this is one where we got to wrestle this one down to the ground. And you can't put much stock into whatever emanations are coming out of the administration, because as those old guys down in Texas and Oklahoma say, a lot of the people in the administration, they're big hat and no cattle. So this is one where you all are going to have to work really hard, and it's not easy. Listening to people from Ketchikan all the way out to Bethel and the Matsu and the Kenai and even Juneau. We're all in this together, and we've all got to work together to solve this issue. Because if we don't, and I'll answer the question I asked Scott and Mike, Alaska will look like West Virginia with bigger mountains if we don't get a handle on protecting this renewable resource that's our permanent fund. Alaska will look like West Virginia without big rivers. Alaska will look like, West Virginia without stupendous wildlife and everything. We got to stop running this thing like it's, the financial system like New Jersey and Illinois and West Virginia, and start running this the way we should. And we can do that if we work together.
I think of Hammond's poem back before the 900 million. How dare this guy sned and contend that we're broke just because we're being a bare-bottom pope. How naive you be if you think Sonny financially sound means you gotta have money. We were famous before they hit the 900 million, and then we went crazy and blew it all.
Well, I don't know how close we are to wrapping up, but I'll say this, Senator Kawasaki and Senator Schauer. I know the permanent fund defenders and all the people we talk to, we understand the difficult task you have of crafting a resolution. And we're committed to coming up with something that works, but it can't be another one of these gimmicks, and it can't be in statute. And I actually believe, I've done a lot of negotiations, legal and all kinds of things over the year. If we all articulate our first principles, that we want permanent protection, that we want a PFD guaranteed, that we want a steady state of revenue for government, and that we want, certainty and finality for this wonderful thing that Clem Tillian and Hugh Malone and Jay Hammond and all the people who went before us set up, we can get that, but it's going to take a little compromise, and we can do it. We have to do it. There's no alternative here. The earnings reserve account money is gone in a year. We can't wait any longer. We have to do this session so it can go out to the citizens for their approval or their rejection. But we can do it.
If it's reasonable, they will not reject it. If you try and protect government instead of people, they will.
I concur, gentlemen, and this is Mike, and my data, and I know Scott sat through some of the committee hearings in 2019. I'm going to go back to that because I think it's important, especially that other legislators hear this, is that the people's attitude towards the dividend, even as we've changed people and people migrate out of the state, new people migrate in 20 years, 2 decades, about half the time we've had the dividend, the attitudes have not changed. They are nearly identical to 20 years ago, even with what is happening. So I agree with you, Clem, and I think it's important that legislators hear that if it's something reasonable, I agree. The people will be okay with that. And if it's fair and balanced, they'll be okay with that. But if it's not, they won't. And the data that I have, that's empirical evidence from committee hearings where I'm marking them off step by step, every single person's testimony, countless hours. And like I said, I know Scott was involved in some of that. It shows it. It's crystal clear. So it is important, but people need to hear that loud and clear, what the people of this state, I think, really want, the vast majority of them.
Yeah, and I think, Mike, we need to have Democrats and Republicans talk about this. This is a big deal. The PFD is a big issue for me as a Democrat, you as a Republican. We might be on other sides of the aisle, but, we agree on 99% of our votes. And it's something that needs to happen in the legislature this session and this next year. So as we move on, I hope that we talk about that.
You're right, Scott. It's not a partisan issue. It is truly an Alaskan issue, and we need to solve it as Alaskans.
Well, it's funny. It's not even the congressional Democrats supported a essentially a PFD, and that was I think sort of strange, but they supported a permanent fund dividend that was larger than the Republicans, and then the congressional Republicans voted it down, right? So it's not a partisan issue. It shouldn't be a partisan issue. It's an issue of making sure that we've got, have money to the people, and this money circulates in the economy.
Yeah, well,
so I think that was a good thing.
This is where I'll betray my Republican leanings, and I am a Republican and have been a long time. The congressional people, whether they're R's or D's, are talking about $600 or $2,000. They're all playing with house money and issuing Federal Reserve notes. The permanent fund is real wealth as long as we protect it, and it came from real oil wealth. And as long as we inflation proof it, it's real wealth. when Congress talks about handing out Federal Reserve notes, they're playing with house money, Senator.
Joe, I have to mention that because I actually said that on my floor speech on the 28th of March. Scott had to listen through my 20-minute diatribe. I was so mad that night that we were not using, and I forget, and I used my fire extinguisher example, but I won't go through that one again here. But it's one of the points I made. I said, the federal stimulus is in essence printed money. It's not real money in the sense of, we're already in over 20 trillion in debt, well above that now. The dividend money is real money. It's our investment. It's almost like a 401k or some other type of form where you have real money invested. Why in the world are we not using ours? And we're not borrowing it. We're not asking from anybody else. It's ours. So anyways, it's a good point.
Thanks, guys. So we have another question dealing with the PFD. I guess why is the PFD? Let's see. So why is the PFD so difficult to put into the Constitution? And is it related to the demographics in the Assembly or in the House and Senate, or is it from some other reason? I guess it's for Mike first, and then for anybody else who wants to clue in.
Boy, so the question really, if I get it right, Scott, is that why is it so difficult to put some type of formula or protection for the PFD into the Constitution? Did I get that right?
Yeah, and again, it takes 3 quarters, so right, the mechanics of it are tough, but why is it so tough?
I think you just keyed on one of the toughest ones. I think Joe mentioned it a few minutes ago, and Scott, you just illuminated that for the question asker is, sometimes we find it very difficult, as everybody on this thread knows, just to get 11 and 21 to pass a bill. So when you start talking 75%, 3/4, a supermajority of 60 legislators, when we often can't even agree enough to barely just pass a bill at 11 and 21 in each chamber, that's a big lift. And you have to consider that in addition to that, there's quite a few varying opinions from folks that actually believe in no dividend at all, for whatever their reasons are. Fair enough. I mean, they can have their opinion. That's fine. But, all the way to those that believe we follow the statutory formula that's been around for 4 decades, and whatever else we do. So it will be difficult, for example, when I hear some legislators say, well, it's free money, it's socialism, it's any number of things other than, the people's share of our resource extraction from the state that we've invested. So you have to, for those that ask questions like that, it's a good question, but you have to understand that not only do you have to get, at this point, 45 of 60 legislators to agree on something, which is really hard to do, but you also have some pretty deep-seated ideological positions about protecting the dividend and then taxing people, because I've heard this all the time, and I know Scott hears it and others. It's like, well, why are we going to give? I've heard Senate presidents say it. Why are we going to give out free money and then turn around and tax people? So it is, for some people, it is a very hard argument to win them across to your point of view of wanting to protect that dividend money, those earnings for the people. At the same time, thinking about, well, yeah, we also have to raise revenue, perhaps through a tax, and perhaps doing something with the oil tax credits, et cetera, et cetera. So again, long answer, I guess, but it's a very daunting problem because there is not agreement, and there is some very large gaps in ideological positions of legislators on how to solve this.
So Mike, I've got your vote, right?
Wait a minute now. I didn't say that. Come on.
But all I can say is I inherited a small amount of AT&T stock. It used to pay $7,000. It went down to $2,400. It's now a little over $3,000 that I'm getting from it. Is that socialism, or is that an investment that my aunt made and left me? And is it mine? And these same people that call this socialism don't see anything wrong with that. They'll take their stock dividends. What's different? What they don't realize is we are a land grant state and that they own the oil. That's pretty hard to get across to anybody from somewhere else, because in every other state, the 90% of it's on private land.
Yeah, and Clem brings a good point. People who conceive of oil wealth as being something that you drill out in Wyoming or something from private land. But, people who have been here a while and understand our big state, whether it's Walter J. Hickel, the owner state, or Clem, and I've been lucky enough to live up here for over 40 years. After you realize after a while, it was a genius move to save 25% of our communal oil. And now the issue is, what are we going to do with that communal oil? There's a few people out there who say, well, let's just divvy it all up and, one big distribution. Well, that doesn't strike me as particularly intelligent. So, but the thing is, to get a supermajority, 3/4 vote, it depends on the question you ask in the legislature. So if I was to go around and ask everybody in the Senate, 20 people, I think I would get at least 15 votes, maybe even 24. Is the permanent fund a good concept? And pretty much everybody would say yes. If you ask, should the citizens get a little slice of their earnings in the form of a dividend? Probably at least 15 and maybe 18 or 20 of the senators would say yes. The devil is in the details, though, where people don't want to put it in the Constitution because that ties their hands. That's one of the arguments.
That's right.
Or they start going, well, it depends on the numbers. So they like the permanent fund might be okay if it was, $50 or something. They don't want to lock it in for guarantee, and they sure don't want to do anything like a 50-50 split. And in fact, if you're talking about the percentage of market value, which it gets all the chatter, but if you do a percentage of market value at 6%, and then you divvy it up 80% for government, some people say, wow, that's great, I can pay all the bills. Yeah, and you can right up until the point where the whole permanent fund is gouged out by inflation. So we can get there, but it's going to take some creative thinking among all the legislators, not just the people who think this is a big deal issue, but we have to deal with this issue now. To postpone it is to make the problem even more formidable 2 years from now, because then the last little remnants of the constitutional budget reserve will be gone. If we don't do it now, when do we do it? And the citizens have a right to see a decent, maybe not perfect, but a decent work product come out of the legislature, passed by at least 15 senators and 30 representatives, that says, here's our best shot at a balanced and fair approach that guarantees a little PFD, that guarantees there'll be some money in perpetuity for government spending, and that still allows, I think, the permanent fund to grow, because that will get better for Clem's grandkids and great grandkids and all the people who follow us down the trail.
Hey, Scott, I'll jump in just briefly on that. And while I won't go down this path because you want to do this in future events, but it does tie back to why I asked the question and talked about it several times, is when you do what Joe is discussing and you get that taken care of, it becomes very important to me, because it does force the legislature and future governors to have to deal with the spending of the state and a sustainable flight path, whatever that looks like. If you have a source of money like now, where the Supreme Court has basically said we can go in every year and pretty much do what we want, it's a very easy thing for us to just go grab what we want and take it. But when it's protected, it does go back to, it makes it very difficult, because now the legislature every year has to think about, well, if we're going to spend more than we have, we're going to have to explain to the people why we've got to come after them for more taxes. We have to explain to businesses why we're going to have to come after them for more revenue. And so it does help when we solve this, as both Joe and Clem mentioned early on, by getting this off the table. I believe it kind of becomes, just like they said, and I don't remember the exact words again, but it helps solve the rest of our problem, because it is more difficult for us. It's just going to be difficult for Scott and I as legislators to have to go back year after year and explain to the people, well, yeah, I know we couldn't, constrain our spending this year, so we're going to have to increase taxes, or explain to the industries that we desperately need why we're going to make it harder for them to earn a profit so that they can grow and expand. So this really is a linchpin. I don't think you can emphasize that point enough to helping us solve our long-term sustainability, as a state, and our viability, for what it's worth.
Well, Butrovich called us when they were repealing the income tax. Incidentally, I was the lone vote in the Senate against repealing it. And he said, please don't do this. He said, we paid in blood for that. But if we hadn't passed it, we wouldn't have become a state, because we had to prove to a number of congressmen that we could raise revenues in our own state. And that's what it was passed for. And it probably was one of the major steps for becoming a state. Now, I wanted to become a commonwealth anyway, so it's where I run the fish and they could run the rest, but that's passed. But the need to be able to balance your own budget and to have no more government than you can pay for. Right now, thank God, we're getting a lot more government than we pay for. I wouldn't want any more.
So I'll pick up on Senator Shower's point about how you fix the PF and the permanent fund dividend problem. In fact, if you adopt a resolution that's passed by our citizens in a vote, as the Constitution requires, and it's a reasonable measure, that in fact becomes what a lawyer would say is a de facto. It in fact is a spending cap of sorts. And it starts forcing these choices about, well, are we going to cut and consolidate entirely? No. Are we going to tax entirely? No. But it will force, and both of you senators, to the extent you're talking to our governor, he's got all these proposals, out here to amend the Constitution 3 different ways. We'll be lucky if we get one constitutional amendment nailed down, and he needs to get behind your efforts of you and your colleagues to deal with the permanent fund and the permanent fund dividend, and basically tell him he can, in his second term, he can deal with the spending cap, and he can deal with the vote of the citizens on taxes, which, by the way, the citizens already have a vote. If the legislature raises an income tax, the citizens within 90 days can say, we want a referendum. And they already have a vote on taxation.
We did it with, remember, they repealed it.
Yeah, so I really urge, both of you senators and your colleagues and the citizens who are listening to this to put our efforts behind the permanent fund. And I think you got real leaders here, one a Republican, one a Democrat, who are going to be working to craft a resolution. And for that, thank you very much.
I think that's your only solution. You get that off the table and the rest will fall into place.
So,
but fall into place.
So thanks, Joe, and thanks, Clem. We only have a couple minutes left in this scheduled meeting. What I would like to do is to offer the floor as a closing comment. We'll give Clem, obviously, a lot of time. And
I share.
Hey, by the way, Clem, I still have Jay Hammond's couch in my office, so anytime you want to swing by, the couch is there for you. But
I might. I've got his pool table in my basement. The kids, we took it out of the man, brought it here. No, it's I'm saying this is the number one problem before us now. And it's just Mike Szymanski sent me a copy of the Harper's Magazine, Louis Lapham's thing on these crazy Alaskans up there. And he wasn't too happy with Juneau sitting there in the rain. And some of his are really interesting stuff. I come out very well, as does Jay Hammond. But the rest, Chuck Cicera, Lou Dishner of all people, the Teamsters Union, saying, you're just going to piss it up against the wall. No, Lou, Rhodes. He said, that's what he said, piss it up against the wall.
This
You're going to build things.
This was 50 years ago. 50 years ago.
Years ago. It hasn't changed. The problem is the same unless you solve it.
Are you done, Clem?
I'm done.
Wow. Okay. Let's go on to Senator Mike Shower, my good colleague in the Senate, who I agree with more often than not. Senator.
Thanks, Scott. So I'm gonna, I think I've made all the points I'd like to make tonight, but I would like to close with an interesting conversation I had a few years ago. Jerry, which I believe Clem and perhaps Joe both know, that was Jay Hammond's, chief of staff for many years. And he still runs around the legislature now and then doing a little lobbyist work. And one night we sat down and he introduced himself and we talked. He said, Mike, he's like, I'm glad you're asking some of these questions, because when I first showed up and I was the appointed guy and I didn't join any caucus and I was out there in a land, I was an island unto myself. And he's like, I'd like to tell you, some things here. So we sat down and we talked for a solid 2 hours. And one of the interesting things about talking to Jerry, he said, I hear a lot of people, and it was what I was trying to counter, different senators and representatives that had been around a long time were trying to interpret what they believed Jay Hammond meant when he said, the having the PFD and it creates the militant ring of people that will protect the fund because they have a vested interest in it. And, he never really meant that. And that's not what he wanted. And he really, he meant it to be for government, only as a rainy day fund, et cetera, et cetera. And so we sat down, he's like, I'm glad you and some others are talking about it, Mike. He's like, because I've been real quiet. And he's like, I knew what Jay Hammond was going to do before he got up out of the chair every morning. I believe was exactly how he put it to me. And he said he absolutely meant for the permanent fund dividend to always be there for the people, as Clem described it, where it was a portion of the resource extraction of the state that the people had ownership in, and the militant ring that would protect it, having a vested interest in it, et cetera, keeping them involved in their government. Those were absolute things that Jerry said Jay meant. So I am fascinated when I hear many, especially some of the older legislators that have been around a while, say things like, well, Jay never meant it for it to happen that way. That was not his intent. And I've got it straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak. It came right from a guy that was with him every day. And, so I think it's important that, when we listen to where and how we got here, what people actually meant, and having a historical record is important for the folks that helped set this up. And Clem, of course, you were around for this. But I wanted to end with that, Scott, because I thought it was very germane to this discussion from somebody that was there as this happened. It was a real time, participant in that. I don't have anything else to add that's important, but I thought it was a fascinating story. So thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I appreciate working with you in the legislature. We're on, opposite sides of the aisle on some issues, but 99% of the time we agree. So just wanted to thank you, Mike.
You bet, Scott. Thanks for the opportunity.
You bet. Joe?
Well, we're going down nostalgia lane here, but I remember one Christmas Eve, Hugh Malone. I was fortunate. Hugh Malone was both a friend of myself and my family, and I was also his personal lawyer on a number of things, including some very funny legal cases. But I remember we were standing in my kitchen one night before we went to mass, and I said to Malone in my younger, kind of slightly snarky way, I said, yeah, you guys, Freeman and all you guys, you just made one big mistake with the permanent fund. And Malone kind of turns to me, I was pouring him an Irish whiskey. And he says, so what's that? And I said, you didn't save enough. And Malone took a sip of whiskey and he kind of arched his eyebrow. Remember how Malone used to do that, Clem? And he says to me,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, this kind of long pause. And he says, yeah, we were lucky to get 25%. And I thought, God, that's really right. And, you know, ever since that moment, I've been committed to working with Clem Tillian and Mike Schauer and Scott Kawasaki and anybody else, Bill Wilikowski, anybody who's willing to put their effort into protecting probably the best thing that came out of all of our oil wealth, which was to save some of it. And that includes the PFD. So, you know, I toast Hugh Malone and Oral Freeman and most of whom aren't around anymore, Jay Hammond. And by the way, Mike Schauer, I'll buy you a beer and tell you about Jay Hammond flying an F4U, because we talked about airplanes when I talked to him.
Now you're
And,
talking my language.
I know he was a modest guy, but you know, he was quite a pilot. Anyway, that's to everybody who's watching this. You're following in the footsteps of great folks. If you stand up for the permanent.
I had the honor of introducing Jay Hammond to the man whose ship he sank at Revolt, Yoshio Okawara. And
That's incredible.
the two of them. And Okawara's son, who became ambassador to the United States. And Jay hit it off right now. It was samurai to samurai. And Jay was one of 4 of 80 pilots that graduated in July 1941 and lived through the war. And you know, it was he was quite a war hero. And the State Department would go nuts. They said, you know, that hick governor from Alaska gets invited to every Japanese function there is, and we can't get an invite.
Well, for all of you who are out there, you're doing good work if you just urge your legislatures, put aside the small differences and get on with the big item, which is getting a resolution that puts the permanent fund and the permanent fund dividend formula in a safe harbor in our Constitution. And that's what we got to do in the next session. And if we work together, we can get her done.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you, Joe.
Or if you pull it off.
I want to thank Joe. I want to thank Clem and Senator Mike Schauer for being online today. You know, I also, we need to thank Juanita Caselius, who organized this whole event. She's online. She's been texting me constantly, along with my staff member, Donahue. Yeah, yeah, you've been getting them, right? And they've been doing an excellent job. And we're going to do this continually. And we talked about keeping it to the PFD today. And we are going to do more during the session as we continue. And I just wanted to thank the 3 of you for being online. Thank the 3 of you for being real PFD defenders. And we'll chat with you real soon. So thank you so much.
All right. Good night, all.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
We're off.
Thanks, Mike.
Bye-bye.
Hey, I'm out.